I still remember standing in that crowded room, the glasses clinking, the laughter echoing, and then hearing my own son smile at his guests and say the words that cut me deeper than any knife. "This is just our housekeeper. We let her stay out of pity. She's good with a mop." My heart stopped. The air felt heavy, and in that moment I realized the people I loved most could turn me invisible with nothing more than a smile and a lie. Thank you so much for watching and giving me a little of your time. It means more than you can imagine. And before I go on, I would love for you to tell me in the comments where you are watching from, because knowing that my story is reaching hearts in different places gives me strength to keep sharing. You see, when my son spoke those words and reduced me to nothing more than a servant in front of strangers, I stood there in silence with a smile that hid the storm inside me. But deep down, I wanted to crumble, because I had walked into that house with hope, carrying cookies I baked with my own hands, wearing my best dress, praying for just one moment of pride in his eyes. I will never forget how I stood in front of the mirror before leaving for that party, my hands trembling as I buttoned the only dress I still kept for special occasions, the same one I had worn years ago to my son's graduation, when I thought my sacrifices had finally meant something. And as I looked at my reflection, I whispered to myself that tonight might be different. Tonight, he might remember that I am more than someone who sweeps floors and scrubs dishes. Tonight, he might look at me and feel pride instead of shame. I took the tray of cookies I had baked, still warm, the scent of cinnamon and chocolate filling my small kitchen, and I wrapped them with the kind of care only a mother knows, because even after all the cold words and the distance that had grown between us, I still carried love in my heart, love that I hoped would soften his, love that I prayed he would finally see. When I arrived at the housewarming, the first thing that struck me was how polished everything looked. The walls freshly painted, the expensive chandelier glowing, the laughter spilling from every corner, and I clutched my cookies tighter, suddenly aware of how out of place I felt, as though I had stepped into a world where I no longer belonged. Guests in elegant clothes strolled by me, their perfume heavy, their smiles polite but distant, and I could feel their eyes flicker over me with the kind of curiosity that stings, as if they wondered who I was and why I'd been invited. My son's wife barely looked at me when I walked in, just a quick glance, and then a smile that did not touch her eyes, the kind of smile people wear when they would rather you disappear into the walls. And I swallowed hard, telling myself not to let it hurt. I tried to stand tall, tried to hold on to the thought that maybe, just maybe, my son had invited me because he wanted me there. Because deep down he remembered the nights I stayed awake stitching his torn clothes, the mornings I skipped meals so he could have enough to eat, the years I worked 2 jobs so he could study and chase the very dreams that had now brought him to this shining house. My heart carried those memories like little lanterns, and I walked into that room with quiet hope, not knowing that in a matter of moments he would snuff out every light I held onto with a single cruel sentence. As I stood there clutching that tray of cookies, trying to steady my breath and remind myself why I came, I could not ignore the way small things had been leading to this very moment, small cracks in the bond I once thought unbreakable. It had begun long before this night, in words tossed aside like scraps, words my son spoke when he thought I wasn't listening, little reminders that I was no longer part of his new world. I remember the day he first told me he and his wife had bought the house, his voice flat as he said, "We'll invite you to the housewarming, but please try to be presentable." And I laughed nervously, pretending it was just a careless joke, though it lingered inside me like a bruise. I brushed it aside because that is what mothers do. We excuse, we forgive, we tell ourselves he is just busy, just stressed, but deep down I knew there was a distance growing between us. A distance I could not cross, no matter how hard I reached out. There had been other moments too. Moments when his wife would sigh at the way I folded laundry, as if my hands had lost all skill. Moments when they spoke about vacations and dinners and plans, but never once included me. And I told myself not to complain, not to make trouble, because I thought if I stayed silent and grateful, I might still hold my place in their lives. Yet silence does not erase what the heart feels. and I carried the weight of being an outsider in my own family. That is why, when I dressed that evening and baked those cookies, I clung to hope like a drowning woman clings to a piece of wood, telling myself that maybe he would see me. Maybe he would smile with pride instead of pity. Maybe he would remember. But when I stepped into that house and looked around, the air itself seemed to whisper otherwise. The laughter of strangers who barely noticed me, the fine polished surfaces that seemed to shine with every success I had once dreamed of for him, and the way he glanced at me quickly before turning away, as though my presence embarrassed him, it all began to tell me the truth I didn't want to admit. I wandered through the rooms quietly, taking in the walls decorated with photographs where I did not appear, family pictures arranged neatly with no trace of the woman who once held his small hand as he took his first steps. Each frame felt like a silent slap, a reminder that I had been erased long before this party began. Still, I held on to my tray and moved toward the laughter, telling myself to stay calm, to smile, to make the best of it. I watched as my son greeted his guests with charm, shaking hands, laughing loudly, boasting of his success, and I thought, yes, I gave him the tools to stand here today. It was my long nights at the research lab, my sacrifices, my hands that built the foundation he stands upon, even if he refuses to see it. I told myself to wait, to believe that he would turn to me and acknowledge me, even with a small gesture, because surely no one forgets their own mother completely. Yet I did not know then that the cruelest blow was still waiting, and that my silence would soon be tested in the most painful way, right there under the glow of that chandelier, with every eye fixed upon us. I tried to steady myself as I stood among the guests, forcing a smile, holding my tray of cookies as though it was my shield, and I watched the way my son moved across the room with such confidence, his shoulders back, his voice loud, introducing everyone to one another as though he had been born into this life of wealth and admiration. He laughed easily, shaking hands, receiving praise, and I could see in his eyes the hunger to be respected, to be admired, to belong in this world he had built for himself. And I wanted so badly to believe that somewhere inside that proud man was the boy I once held close, the boy who used to look at me with trust and gratitude. I waited quietly, standing just close enough to hear him speak, telling stories of his new house, how hard he had worked for it, how much he and his wife had sacrificed, and with every word he spoke, I felt my place in his life shrinking smaller and smaller, as though the story of his success had no room left for me at all. Then came the moment that has burned itself into my memory forever. The moment he turned to me with a smile that held no warmth, and with his boss and colleagues gathered around, he gestured in my direction and said, "This is just our housekeeper. We let her stay out of pity. She's good with a mop." My breath caught in my chest, and for a second I thought perhaps I had heard wrong. Perhaps my ears had betrayed me, but the polite laughter that followed told me otherwise. My hands tightened around the tray, my heart sank so low I thought it would stop beating altogether. And yet I stood there, frozen in place, unable to cry, unable to speak, only able to feel the weight of every sacrifice I had made crash down on me all at once. The walls seemed to close in, the air grew heavy, and I could hear my own silence louder than the music playing in the background. Inside me, a storm raged, memories flooding in uninvited. The years I spent working late in a research lab, the papers I wrote, the discoveries I made, the dreams I gave up when I chose to raise him, the life I left behind so he could have a future. All of it seemed to scream within me, demanding to be remembered, demanding to be acknowledged, and yet here I was, reduced to nothing more than a cleaner in the story of his life. I wanted to cry out, to tell them who I really was, to demand that he look at me and see me. But I bit my tongue, because I knew in that moment that dignity did not need to be shouted, it sits quietly, waiting, and I felt something inside me shift. I caught a glimpse of the guests, some smiling politely, some glancing at me with pity, others avoiding my eyes altogether, and I wondered if they believed him. If they truly thought I was just a woman taken in out of kindness, a burden dressed in an old gown, clutching homemade cookies, as though that was all I had to give. My son did not look at me again after he spoke those words. He turned back to his guests, laughing, as if he had erased me with a sentence. and in that moment I understood a truth I had long been avoiding. He was no longer ashamed just in private. He was willing to cast me aside publicly, to diminish me in front of those whose respect he craved, and it was a wound far deeper than any other. Yet even as the sting spread through me, I held my head steady. I stood tall, because I knew something he did not. I knew that life has a way of revealing the truth, no matter how deep someone tries to bury it. And though he thought he had silenced my story with his careless words, he had no idea that the very people he wished to impress were about to see me in a light that would undo everything he thought he controlled. The silence that followed his words seemed to stretch on forever, as though the whole room was waiting to see what would happen next. And in that silence, I felt my heart breaking. But then something shifted. Something I had not expected at all. His boss, a tall man with sharp eyes and a voice that carried authority even when spoken softly, tilted his head and looked at me closely. Not with pity, not with dismissal, but with recognition, as though a memory had suddenly returned to him. He took a step closer, his gaze steady, and then he asked in a calm, deliberate tone, "Are you sure?" "Because I know her." The sound of those words cut through the room like a blade, and for the first time that evening, all eyes turned away from my son and onto me. I watched my son's smile falter, just for a moment, confusion flickering across his face, and my breath caught in my chest as his boss continued, "That is not just a housekeeper. That is Dr. Harris. She led the research grant that funded our company." The room fell completely still, the laughter died, and I could feel every pair of eyes fixed on me with shock, disbelief, and sudden curiosity. The tray of cookies in my hands felt weightless, my heart pounding so loudly I thought everyone could hear it, and in that instant I saw the color drain from my son's face, his pride crumbling as the truth he had tried to bury rose to the surface in front of everyone he wanted to impress. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some guests whispered to one another, others stared openly, and I stood in the middle of it all, torn between the pain of his betrayal and the quiet satisfaction that the truth had found its way back to me without me having to utter a single word. My son's wife shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting between me and the boss, and I could see the panic starting to rise in both of them as the room filled with the weight of truth they could not control. Inside me, the storm that had raged only moments before began to settle into something different, something stronger, because I realized that the dignity I thought I had lost was never truly gone. It was only waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. I stood taller then, my silence no longer born of shame, but of strength, and I let his boss's words echo in the room, let them hang in the air so that everyone present could absorb them. The very foundation of my son's carefully crafted image had cracked in front of his own guests, and as he struggled to find his words, I felt no need to rescue him, no need to soften the blow, because the truth was finally speaking louder than his lies. It was a moment I will never forget, a moment when everything shifted, and though I did not raise my voice or defend myself, I knew the entire room now saw me for who I truly was, and not the shadow my son had tried to make me. As I stood there in that room, letting the silence and the truth breathe through every corner, memories of the life I had lived before motherhood washed over me like a tide I could no longer hold back. Long before I was called a housekeeper, long before I was reduced to pity, I was a woman with a mind that burned with ideas and hands that worked tirelessly to bring them into reality. I remembered the late nights under fluorescent lights in that research lab, the rows of papers scattered across my desk, the endless calculations and experiments that so many dismissed until they finally bore fruit. I remembered the moment we secured the grant, the pride in my team's eyes, and the knowledge that the work we were doing was not just lines on a page, but the foundation of something far bigger than we could imagine. And yet, when my son was born and I looked into his face, I knew that my path would change. I told myself that family came first, that love meant sacrifice, and so I stepped back, not because I had failed, but because I believed giving him a future was more important than any recognition the world could give me. I never told him the full truth of what I had left behind, because I wanted him to grow on his own, to build his own name, never realizing that in doing so he would one day believe I had none of my own. He never knew that while I taught him to read, while I cooked simple meals and stretched every dollar to keep him clothed and fed, I still quietly received updates from the very company his boss now stood for. Updates reminding me that my fingerprints were still there, etched into its foundation forever. I still owned a piece of it, though I never boasted, never flaunted it, because wealth and titles meant nothing to me compared to the warmth of a child's laughter, the pride of watching him take his first steps, the joy of seeing him succeed. But standing in that house, hearing him strip me of every ounce of dignity, I realized the painful irony. He thought the foundation of his world was his alone, when in truth it was built on the sacrifices I made in silence. His boss remembered me not because of pity, not because of charity, but because he had seen me at my best, because he knew the fire I once carried, the determination that helped shape what now stood before them. As those thoughts swirled inside me, I lifted my chin and let the quiet truth settle into my heart. For I understood now that I had never been erased. I had only been hidden behind the shadows of my own sacrifice, and now the light had found me again, not by my own hand, but by the very man my son sought to impress. In that moment, I did not need to shout or defend myself, for the past had risen to the surface, undeniable and unshakable, and every person in that room could see that I was not the nameless servant my son had tried to paint me as, but a woman with a story, a history, and a dignity that no lie could ever bury. The weight of the moment lingered in the air, thick and unshakable, and I could see my son's expression shift from confidence to panic as the truth pressed down on him in front of the very people he wanted to impress. His laughter faltered, his mouth opened as if to speak, but no words came out, only silence, a silence that betrayed the fear rising inside him. His wife clutched her glass tighter, her knuckles white, her eyes darting around the room searching for an escape, and I could feel their world beginning to crack. Piece by piece, under the force of something they could no longer control. Guests who had moments earlier been charmed by his stories now leaned toward one another, whispering, their eyes filled with surprise and curiosity, some even turning to me with looks of respect they had not offered when they thought I was nothing more than a woman who swept floors. I stood there with my tray of cookies still in my hands, steady as stone, letting the storms swirl around me, knowing that the power I had lost in his words had returned without me having to say a single thing. His boss's voice echoed still. That is Dr. Harris. She led the research grant that funded our company. And I let those words fill the silence again and again, because I could see the shame sinking into my son's face as he realized his lie had been shattered. He wanted so desperately to control the story, to paint me as small, as powerless, but now the story had turned against him, and he was left standing exposed before the very people he craved approval from. Some of the guests began to look at me differently, with recognition that went beyond titles or positions, recognition of the quiet strength it takes to step aside for love, the dignity it takes to carry sacrifice without demanding acknowledgement. And though none of them spoke it aloud, I could feel the room tilting in my direction, their eyes saying what their mouths did not. That they saw me now, truly saw me, and in that moment I no longer felt like an intruder in that shining house. I felt something deeper, something unshakable, the kind of respect that cannot be begged for or demanded, but only earned through years of silent endurance. My son shifted uncomfortably, attempting to laugh it off, muttering something about how I must be exaggerating, but his voice lacked the certainty it once carried, and the boss's stern expression silenced him further. I did not need to correct him, did not need to fight to be heard, because the truth was alive in the room now, and there was no shutting it away. I stood calm, my heart no longer heavy with shame but lifted with quiet pride, because at last the mask he had tried to place on me had slipped away. And the woman I had always been, the woman who sacrificed and built and endured, stood visible again, undeniable before every eye in that room. I could see the color draining from my son's face, his pride stripped away in front of the very people he longed to impress. And in that instant I realized he was no longer the confident man holding the center of attention. He was once again the boy who had depended on me for everything. Only now, he wanted to erase the very foundation that had carried him this far. His hands fidgeted as he tried to gather himself, forcing a nervous smile, but every attempt at charm fell flat against the weight of the truth that had already been spoken. His wife shifted beside him, her cheeks flushed red, her eyes refusing to meet mine, and I could feel the unease rippling through them both as the whispers in the room grew louder. I stood motionless, my silence deliberate, because I knew that sometimes words are not needed. Sometimes the truth speaks loudest when you allow it to breathe on its own. My son tried to speak again, stumbling over his words, insisting lightly that there must have been a mistake. But no one believed him anymore, and his boss's unwavering gaze silenced him more than I ever could. I did not feel joy in his humiliation, only a strange mix of sorrow and vindication, for I never wished to see him fall, only to be seen as the mother who had lifted him higher than she had ever lifted herself. Yet here he stood, undone by his own arrogance, and I could do nothing but watch. The guests shifted uncomfortably, some nodding toward me with newfound respect, others whispering about the revelation, and I saw how quickly the tide of admiration had turned away from him and onto me. For years I had been invisible, tucked quietly in the corners of his life, erased from the photographs, hidden behind dismissive smiles. But now I stood at the center, not because I demanded it, but because truth has a way of forcing its way into the light. My son's face betrayed 1,000 unspoken apologies, though his lips could not form the words, and in that silence, I felt the sharp ache of betrayal mix with the bittersweet comfort of justice. I held my tray of cookies tighter, a symbol of the woman he wanted the world to believe I was, but inside, I knew I was so much more, and now everyone else knew it too. I did not scold him. I did not expose the rest of what I still held, because I understood then that my quiet strength was louder than any outburst, and his shame would haunt him far longer than any words I could speak. It was in that moment that I understood the power of dignity, the kind of power no one can strip away. And as the room turned colder for him and warmer for me, I realized the balance of our story had shifted forever. As I stood there, letting the whispers and the shifting glances fill the room, I felt a calmness rise inside me that I had not known for years, a calmness born not from being accepted, but from knowing that the truth had broken free without me lifting a finger. My son tried once more to laugh, his voice strained as he insisted that perhaps his boss had confused me with someone else. Yet even as the words left his mouth, his eyes betrayed the fear that everyone could see. His wife tugged gently at his sleeve, urging him to move on, but the damage had already been done, for the story he had tried to control had slipped away from his grasp. And the eyes of every guest remained fixed on me with a curiosity that no longer carried pity, but something closer to respect. I said nothing, not because I lacked words, but because I had learned long ago that silence often cuts deeper than shouting. And in that silence, he was forced to face what he had tried to bury. The tray of cookies in my hands no longer felt like a symbol of smallness. They felt like proof of love, proof of care, proof that even in the face of his rejection I had chosen kindness, while he had chosen cruelty. And as I stood with that quiet offering pressed close to me, I understood that my presence in that room was no longer a mark of pity. It was a reminder that dignity cannot be erased, no matter how hard someone tries. The guests shifted their focus toward me, some nodding slightly, others leaning in to hear if I would speak, and I let them wait, let them see that I had no need to prove myself, no need to defend against the lie. His boss, however, did not look away. His eyes locked firmly on me, as though to remind the room that he spoke the truth and would not allow it to be dismissed. I felt an odd sense of protection in that moment, not because I needed anyone to fight for me, but because his recognition had restored a part of me I thought had been lost forever. I glanced at my son then, and for the first time that night I allowed myself to see him, not as the man I had raised, not as the boy I once carried, but as a stranger who stood ashamed in his own house, undone not by me, but by the truth he thought he could silence. My heart ached, for love never truly disappears even under betrayal, but I also knew that I could not carry the weight of his choices anymore. I had given him everything, and in return he tried to strip me of my name. Yet here I stood, my name spoken aloud again, strong and clear in the air he wished to own. In that stillness, I realized that my power did not come from proving him wrong. It came from knowing that I had never needed his approval to be whole. And as the guests continued to whisper and shift uneasily, I stood taller, not as a housekeeper, not as a burden, but as the woman I had always been, finally visible once more. The air in the room had changed, and I could feel it pressing against my son, as though the walls themselves were closing in on him. And for the first time in his life, he had no clever words, no practiced charm, no way to twist the story into something that suited him. He stood there with his shoulders stiff, his eyes darting between his boss and the guests, searching desperately for someone to rescue him. But no one spoke. No one offered him the comfort he so freely denied me. His wife stayed silent too, her face pale, her lips pressed tightly together, and I saw in her expression the realization that the man she had chosen to stand beside was not as strong as he had pretended to be, that his pride had been built on fragile lies that now lay shattered at his feet. I held myself steady, every muscle calm, because I had nothing left to prove, nothing left to fight for, and that calmness was a power he could not touch. I looked around at the faces staring at me, the curiosity in their eyes, the whispered questions they dared not speak aloud. And I let them see me as I was, not through his words, not through pity, but through the quiet truth of my presence. I could almost hear the memories of my past rushing back into me, the long nights of research, the sacrifices I carried without complaint, the choices I made that gave him the life he stood in now, and I felt a bittersweet ache as I realized how blind he had been to it all. For so long I had wondered if my silence had made me weak, if stepping back from the life I once had meant I had disappeared entirely. But standing in that room, I understood that sacrifice is never weakness. It is the quiet strength that builds futures. And though he tried to erase me, he could not erase what I had given. I let my eyes rest on him one last time, and I saw the small boy I once comforted in the dark, the young man I had cheered for when he took his first steps into success, and now the man standing hollow, stripped bare in front of his own guests. And my heart broke for him even as I felt justice settle gently into my hands. There was no need to speak, no need to humiliate him further, because life had already placed the mirror in front of him, showing him exactly who he had become, and I knew that image would haunt him long after the party ended. My silence was not emptiness, it was strength, and in that silence I carried every lesson I had ever lived through, every truth he thought he had buried, every piece of love he thought he could twist into shame. And I realized I had finally reclaimed myself without raising my voice at all. As I stood there with the weight of silence filling the room, I felt a strange peace settling over me. Not because the wound of his words had disappeared, but because the truth had finally risen to the surface, and no one could push it back down again. I watched my son struggle in that silence, his chest rising and falling quickly, his fingers tapping against the side of his glass, as though the rhythm could keep him steady. But nothing could steady him now. Not when the mask he had worn so proudly had been ripped away. His eyes searched mine, desperate, perhaps hoping for forgiveness, perhaps begging me to rescue him as I had done all his life. But I kept my gaze calm and unshaken, because I knew this was not my burden to carry anymore. The guests were still whispering, some leaning closer to one another, their voices hushed but sharp with curiosity, and I could feel the air thick with judgment, not toward me, but toward him. The man who had paraded his mother as a servant, only to be unmasked by the very truth he had tried to bury. His boss stood tall, saying nothing more, because his words had already done enough, and that silence spoke louder than any defense could. My son's wife avoided my eyes, her head lowered, her smile forced and trembling, and I realized she too had played hurt in erasing me, brushing me aside, treating me as though I were a stain to be hidden. But now she could not deny the look of respect that others gave me, a respect she had never shown. I held my tray of cookies, the symbol of a mother's quiet offering, and I thought about how many years I had carried love in small gestures, never demanding thanks, never asking for recognition, only giving and giving until there was nothing left of me but the memory of what I had once been. Yet now, without me speaking a single word, without me defending myself or raising my voice, they all saw me again. Saw the woman who had built something lasting. The woman who had given more than anyone realized. And in that moment, I knew the power of truth was not in revenge, but in letting the weight of reality settle where it belonged. On the shoulders of those who had denied it. I did not gloat, I did not smile, because this was not triumph. It was something heavier, something deeper. It was the reminder that love can be twisted, sacrifice can be forgotten, and loyalty can be repaid with shame, but dignity has a way of surviving it all. And as I stood in that house surrounded by strangers who now looked at me differently, I felt the years of silence unravel. Not into noise, but into clarity. And I understood that while my son's pride had crumbled, my strength had quietly taken its rightful place in the light. When I finally stepped out of that house later that evening, the cool night air touched my face and I felt lighter. Not because the hurt was gone, but because the truth had spoken louder than any lie ever could. I walked away with my head high, carrying not the shame he tried to place on me, but the dignity I had always owned. And I knew he would remember that moment for the rest of his life. Thank you, my dear ones, for staying with me until the very end of my story. It means so much to share these pieces of my heart with you. And if my words touched you in any way, I invite you to subscribe and stay with me here, because together we will walk through many more stories of strength, truth, and quiet justice.